One of the hardest things I've ever tried to understand is how a mother can love her children and still choose not to protect them. There's a narrative no one likes to talk about when it comes to childhood abuse. We don't like talking about the parent who knew, but didn't stop the behavior from happening. For a long time, I didn't know how to make sense of my mother's role in my own story, because she wasn't the one hurting us, but she also wasn't protecting us. And that space in between is where a lot of confusion and where a lot of pain lives. I remember believing that one day everything would shift, that if the truth came out and if there was proof, or if something big enough happened, that my mom would finally choose us. When my father was arrested in 2010, I thought that was the moment. I thought she would finally be free of him, free from his control, free from the fear, free from him dictating all of her actions. And I really thought that she would step into the role that I had always needed her to be. But she didn't. Instead, she bailed him out 2 days before I got married. And not just that, she then spent the next 2 days begging and pleading with me to let him come to my wedding. For a long time, I saw her actions as betrayal. And let's just be clear, they were definitely betrayal. But as I've gotten older, I've also come to understand that there's a lot more complicated feelings and actions beneath that. Because my father didn't just control our household, he also controlled her. My father spent years conditioning my mother to believe things like a good wife stands by her husband no matter what, and that family problems stay inside the family, and that choosing your children over your husband is betrayal. And those beliefs, when they're reinforced year after year and decade after decade, they just don't feel like control anymore. They feel very much like the truth. He isolated her from outside perspectives. She wasn't encouraged or allowed to talk to family. She wasn't supported in seeking outside advice or counsel. And so when someone only hears one voice in your ear for so long, that voice becomes their only reality. She also heavily depended on him for money, for stability, for identity, which means that leaving or even challenging him was extremely hard. And frankly, it probably felt impossible for her. And then there was fear. And I'm not talking about physical fear, but emotional fear, so much of it. If she upset him or did something he didn't like, he would threaten to leave, or he'd threaten suicide or hurting himself. He'd blame her for his behavior. Sometimes he'd just take off for days at a time and say, he was upset about something and he needed to clear his head. Everything was her fault, including his affairs or things he did to us. So over time, my assumption is that her decisions weren't based on what was right at all, but they were based on what felt survivable. And layered on top of that was religion, a very toxic version of religion. We were raised in a very conservative environment where divorce wasn't seen as an option, where loyalty to your husband was expected no matter what. So there were no counterbalances. No one was saying, like, this isn't okay, or you should leave, or your children matter more. The situation of being and supporting her husband just was. And I remember arguing with her in my teens and citing Matthew 19:9 and saying, look, it says that with sexual immorality, my father's multiple affairs, you can leave because he's committed adultery. And yet she refused, citing instead that, oh no, divorce is never acceptable. So even when that religion supported her survival in divorce and leaving, she couldn't see that because for so many years, he had been in her ear saying that she was not allowed to leave him. For a long time, I told myself, she's a victim too. I even told law enforcement when they were considering charging her with child endangerment, child neglect, not to, because she was a victim of my father as well. But slowly that perspective shifted for me, unfortunately. 2010 is the year that I worked with detectives to get a recorded confession from my father, and very shortly after that, he was arrested. And that was the same time I told detectives not to go after my mother. But all of a sudden, my mother was angry. Overnight, she decided that nothing I had said was true any longer, that I was making things up. She literally went from being angry at my father for abusing me, trying to figure out how to magically mend our relationship, to all of a sudden declaring that I was a bold-faced liar in the span of moments. And with that, I slowly began to realize that she wasn't just a victim. She had an opportunity. She had proof. She believed me, at least initially. She had a way out. I truly thought that once he was locked away, that she would step in and protect us. I had been convinced that once he was stuck in jail, she had her way out. She could finally escape his clutches because he wasn't there to stop her. But that's not what happened. She chose to go back to him. She chose to bail him out of jail. She chose to believe his lies. She chose not to protect her younger children. She chose instead to let me take on that responsibility instead of stepping into it herself, instead of fighting for her children. And over time, I had to face something very difficult. Someone can be controlled, and they can still be responsible for the choices they make within that control. She chose to go back to my abuser, despite all of my efforts to protect my siblings and to protect her. Years ago, I read a book that helped me to start to understand this dynamic, the dynamic of a mother not protecting her children. But understanding the dynamic does not erase the harm that was caused. It doesn't undo what happened. It certainly doesn't make it okay. But it does explain how a mother can be so conditioned to loyalty that she loses the ability and the willingness to protect her own children. To this day, I still feel anger towards my mother at times, though mostly I reflect on her with sadness these days. What's strange is I'm not really angry at my father anymore. I think it's because I understand exactly who he is. He's not a good person. There are no expectations there. I got justice for what he did to me. I will never have to see him again. And frankly, he doesn't even cross my mind unless I'm working on a video or some kind of story like this. But my mother, it's so strange. She wasn't inherently a bad person. She was generally kind, agreeable, and that's what for me makes it so much harder to understand. How is it that someone who seemed good could allow so much harm to happen right in front of her? That tension between who she was and what she allowed is where a lot of my anger lived. Trying to reconcile her betrayal with who she is as a person is where a lot of that anger comes from. She has a support system, her siblings, her parents. She could have left him. She could have protected us. If she had told any of her family, they would have helped her to get away from him and to save us from him. But instead, it feels as if we were so unimportant to her that it was better to let that harm continue than it was for her to try to live without him. I've worked for years in therapy on this topic, and most of the anger has cooled, and frankly, I'm striving for pure indifference, that same indifference I pretty much have with my father, but it's still hard. I still long to have a loving mother that I can talk to, but I know that will never happen, and that makes me very sad. I've been effectively no contact with my mother for about 10 years now, but I still do see her at the occasional family gatherings, and she still creates drama in my life occasionally. When I got married to my now husband, she made quite the stink when she realized she wasn't invited. And so there's a lot of things that keep popping up with her, unlike my father, who I will never and have not had contact with in the last 15 years. So with her, every time I do see her, it ends up being a lot of mental exhaustion, thinking about how to deal with her presence, how to put up those barriers, even if it is only a few times a year. For me, healing wasn't just about understanding my father, my abuser. It was also about understanding her and learning that you can hold both truths at the same time, that she was shaped by control and that she still failed to protect us. Both of those things are true and both of those things matter. But just because she was a victim as well does not excuse her failure to protect us. If this is something you've experienced too, you are not alone in how absolutely confusing and frustrating it can feel. Thank you for being here with me. I'm Janae Cherie, and I hope that my story helps you to tell yours.